Hi everybody and welcome to Mark Overanalyzes Film. Today, for the final episode of Season 2, I will be overanalyzing the structural masterpiece that is Groundhog Day. Just a quick note here before we begin. I always struggle with being happy with each individual episode of this podcast. It's kind of the way I am. I always want them to be better, more precise, and more elegant in their structure and their expression. But I really am very proud of the 2 seasons I've done so far, and I really have learned a tremendous amount from doing this. More importantly, I really believe that almost anyone would come away from an episode understanding the relevant film better than they did before. And so I want to take the next step now and start applying what I've learned to help people more directly. If you or anyone you know have a story that you'd like or that you need to tell, and you like my approach, and you could do with some assistance or someone just to talk it out with, you can now check out my website, markoveranalysesstory.com. I started this podcast to help people understand stories better, and I really get a kick out of the idea that I might help some writers out there to tell their stories, and maybe even get some good movies made. But anyways, we're here to talk Groundhog Day, so let's talk Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day was directed by Harold Ramis, who co-wrote the screenplay with story creator Danny Rubin. Now, it's February and 30 years since its release, so why not overanalyze Groundhog Day? But really, the main reason I have been wanting to overanalyze this film and why I'd like to finish the season on it is the purity of its premise and how and why that premise has become so useful and popular for telling stories. That premise is in fact so pure that it is never even explained, and you wouldn't even really notice. There is no reason given in the film for why this actually happens, and no reason stated for why it ends. And this is a very commercial, lighthearted film. It's not some Lynchian exploration of the subconscious. So how does it get away with that? With all that in mind, first I'll look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. Then I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the 5 key questions about the protagonist. Question 1, whose story is it? Or basically, who is the protagonist? This is the story of Phil Connors. Phil is a disgruntled weatherman around 40. He's working for a small TV station. But most importantly, Phil is deeply unhappy and either thinks or acts that he's too good for just about everything. Question 2. What is his life dream? Life dream here refers to what it is that the protagonist wants or is aiming to do when the film begins and the story has yet to properly start. When we first meet Phil, he's talking up the idea of a major network looking at him. He wants a better job, more money, and perhaps mostly more prestige for his own selfish ego. Question 3. What is his want? Want here is what the character is trying to achieve in Act 2 of the film, from the moment they really begin their journey until the moment they are at their most defeated. As such, it is a SMART goal in that it is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, this is generally where I find it starts getting really interesting for me. It's not totally clear that there's one goal really driving Phil throughout this, and it's certainly not time-bound, far from it. But broadly speaking, Phil really realizes what's happening to him and begins looking to escape Groundhog Day at the 25-minute mark. However you want to phrase it exactly, he appears to stop fighting it at minute 74. This is our 49-minute second act. So broadly speaking, I'm going to say that Phil's want is to escape, or at least find the limitations of, this time loop he appears to be stuck in. Question 4. What is his need? Need is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the character lacks at the beginning of the story. Now, the simple answer here is that Phil needs to learn to live unselfishly, right? Or that he needs to become a good person. And those are perfectly good answers, really. But I can't really help but think about William Broyles Jr. talking about his screenplay for the film Castaway, another film about a man who feels entirely alone for what seems like an eternity. Broyles said that the film ends with the words "thank you" because Tom Hanks's character has somehow accepted that there is no rationale for what happens to us, but finally there is gratitude. And that feels appropriate here. Phil Connors doesn't really ever learn why whatever happened to him, but he needs to learn to be truly grateful for it. He needs to be truly grateful for his life, even on its potentially worst day. This is, of course, also highly reminiscent of It's a Wonderful Life, and curiously, A Christmas Carol, which Bill Murray had already remade in his own version, Scrooged. Question 5. Does he get what he wants and or what he needs? So, at the end of our second act, Phil is still stuck in his time loop, and it appears he will be forever. But eventually, he does indeed get what he wants by getting what he needs. In learning to be grateful for the beauty of everyday life and appreciate the moment, Phil appears to be released from whatever has been occurring to him. So, now that I've attempted to answer the 5 key questions, let's have a look at Groundhog Day's sequences. Traditionally, there are roughly 8 sequences or stages in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. So a good way to think about this is that roughly every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. There are definitely 8 stages to Groundhog Day, but I'm going to say there's probably 10 sequences, as I'll get into. I'll also add one quick note here, as there's nowhere else to really easily put it. Groundhog Day is just a beautifully structured film to my mind, and one of the signs of that is that if you were to take a 5-act Shakespearean style approach to analysing it, there would be 2 sequences for every act, and the story is almost perfectly balanced. It's almost perfectly symmetrical. The first act is 25 minutes, the second is 18 minutes, the third act is 13 minutes, the fourth is 17, and the final 5th act is 24. So, 25, 18, 13, 17, 24. But also, the sequences are so snappy and the transitions are so smooth that you would never even realize that all of this is happening. Even at the end, it kind of takes some time for the true resolution to reveal itself. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Act 1 contains our first 2 sequences, and the first of these is generally Life as It Is. Now, this is an interesting one to note. The original draft of the script has us meeting Phil very much already in the time loop, and we only learn what's happening to him at the end of Act 1 in a voiceover narration. My immediate instinct is that the beginning they eventually went for is definitely the right choice. So we spend the first 7-ish minutes of Groundhog Day seeing what a normal day for Phil actually looks like. And it would probably be a really nice life if he wasn't an obnoxious jackass who takes a needless dunk on blood sausage. First, we see that Phil is a smart aleck weatherman whose career seems to have stalled out a bit, and he's about to visit Punxsutawney for Groundhog Day for the 4th time. But who's counting? Phil, apparently, and also his news anchor, who really enjoys how bitter he is about it. So, he meets his new peppy producer Rita, and slightly dim cameraman Larry, and heads for the now famous town. He makes a truly hateful, unforgivable crack about blood sausage, and then is dropped off at a very nice B&B on Cherry Street. And then, 7.5 minutes in, we enter day 1. Phil wakes up to "I Got You Babe" and some mindless radio chatter. He meets a chirpy neighbor outside, chats to the owner of the B&B, and then heads to work. On the way, he passes a homeless man, clearly in desperate need, and then runs into Ned Ryerson, arguably the most iconically annoying person ever committed to celluloid. He then heads to work and does a sarky report on the groundhog appropriately predicting a winter that is unlikely to end soon. Now, we will visit the events up to this point repeatedly, After this, though, the day will present a lot more variation. For the sake of comparison with his last day, though, let's discuss briefly what this Phil Connors does on day 1. He tries desperately to get out of town, then tries to place a long-distance phone call, then gets a drink and refuses to go to the party with Rita and Larry. He has a cold shower, and he goes to bed. So, it's not a great day. And then, 18 minutes in, something strange happens. We get our first real tension, and so we enter sequence 2. Now, here's one of the most fascinating things to my mind about Groundhog Day. Right here, between sequence 1 and sequence 2, we would normally have what we call our inciting incident, or the event without which our story as it is would not happen. Now, it doesn't have to be here, it just has to be somewhere in our Act 1, but it's most normally here. But strangely, Groundhog Day doesn't just have it here, it doesn't really have one at all. At least not an obvious one. Rather, Phil Connors just wakes up the following morning, but it isn't the following morning. Phil wakes up once again to "I Got You, Babe" and the same mindless radio chatter, and he slowly realizes that he is indeed experiencing the same day all over again.
Morning! See the groundhog?
Yeah?
Think it'll be an early spring.
Didn't we do this yesterday?
I don't know what you mean.
Don't mess with me, pork chop. What day is this?
It's February 2nd. Groundhog Day.
Yeah. Sorry. You know, I thought it was yesterday.
Oh.
The neighbor, the owner, the homeless man, needle-nosed Ned, Rita, Larry. Now, it's worth pointing out here that we are not yet in Act 2 because Phil doesn't know if this is some kind of bizarre one-off. He tells the B&B owner that his chance of departure is, maybe 75 or 80%. To end the day, he snaps a pencil in half and leaves it by the bed. And at an exemplary 25 minutes in, Phil wakes up for the 3rd time on Groundhog Day to find his pencil unsnapped. Both he and we realize that this is a problem now, and we wonder our big question that will drive the middle of our story: will Phil escape Groundhog Day? And so we end Act 1, and we enter Act 2. Act 2 begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem, as we wonder some version of the sequence tension: will Phil figure out what's causing this? Now, Sequence 3 normally begins with a "what's the plan" scene, which really tells us what our Act 2 is going to look like. So Phil wakes up in a panic and rushes past a lot of the same stuff he has already rushed past. So that's one thing. But also notice what he's doing here. He is rushing to speak to Rita. That is the plan for Act 2. Repeat a lot of the same stuff and get closer to Rita. And interestingly, even though he's already lived this day twice, it's here at the beginning of Act 2 where we first see arguably one of Groundhog Day's most iconic locations, the Tip Top Diner. And you might notice how we keep returning to this diner with Rita more than anywhere in Act 2 to mark the big changes in Phil. As we'll see, it's something of a yardstick location. But for now, we have Phil's first attempts to solve the problem. He gets an x-ray and a counseling session, but neither provides him with any answers whatsoever. There is no rational, practical answer. And so Phil goes for another kind of answer: drinking. Now, it's important to note that Sequence 3 is also defined by what we term the refusal of the call, and then ends with an acceptance of the call. This acceptance of the call is also the character's first unconscious move towards their need. And you could land on a couple of things here. You could say that Phil is first mean to and then later bonds with some locals. These are the two guys that he gets drunk with and then involves in a police chase. That does make sense, especially as these two guys are the first locals who Phil gets to know, so it really feels like an unconscious move towards his need. But I'm more inclined to think that this sequence is all about Phil trying to escape Groundhog Day before eventually becoming excited by the possibilities that with no tomorrow, he can actually do whatever he wants. This is his real unconscious move. It's not a real gratitude for everyday life yet, but it is a small step in that direction. And so, Phil fails in his first attempts to escape Groundhog Day, gets arrested, and learns that he has unfettered freedom. He has not figured out what's causing this, but he has figured out that he can have some fun with it. And so we enter sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem, as we wonder, will Phil tire of shallow fun? Now, it took me a while to figure out what the tension of this next short sequence was, because it's really just Phil screwing around for 9 minutes. In his contentiously straightforward screenwriting book Save the Cat, Blake Snyder describes this portion of a film as the fun and games section.
Oh, no, no one like that. Will there be?
Apparently not. Will you hold my room for me, please? I'm going to stay an extra day. Catch you tomorrow.
Hey! Phil? Phil? Hey! Phil Connors!
Ned?
So here we see Phil knock Ned the head right out with glorious abandon, eat whatever he wants in any quantity he wants in the cafe with Rita, it should be noted. He beds the attractive local Nancy Taylor, he steals from a money truck, and he dresses up to go see his favorite film with what I can only assume is a prostitute, which seems like a weird added little thing, but anyways. You might also notice that this is where the film really accelerates. In the previous 34 minutes we had 3 Groundhog Days. Here it feels like we have at least that many again in 9 minutes. But Phil does start to run out of his own ideas for shallow fun to have, and so at minute 43, something really begins to change. Phil turns his attention firmly to Rita now, and so we enter sequence 5 as we wonder, will Phil succeed in getting Rita to really like him? You might recall that when Phil first sees Rita, he describes her as fun, but not his kind of fun. And that's important, because Rita is the personification of Phil's need. And so when Phil begins pursuing her, he begins experimenting with that need. Now at this point he's still fundamentally a creep, so we know he's doing all of this for less than ideal reasons. But at this stage, that's kind of the point. We see him experiment and experiment and experiment to manufacture the perfect day with Rita. Again, notice they have a scene in the cafe to show this change. 17 minutes ago, he was begging for help. 9 minutes ago, he was stuffing his face to her disgust. Now, he's asking Rita about herself. For selfish reasons, yes, but he is changing. So, he eventually learns to drink to world peace. He learns to not exclaim that 18th century French poetry is a waste of time. And then something happens. In his novel Mother Night, Kurt Vonnegut famously wrote, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be very careful what we pretend to be." And so Phil, in pretending to be a nice, interested person that Rita would be interested in, momentarily becomes a nice, interested person that Rita would be interested in. And this, at minute 50 into a 98-minute runtime, is Groundhog Day's midpoint, or our protagonist's first conscious move towards his need.
Where'd you get that?
Well, I went over to the snowman shop. Hey, an assassin! I'll protect you, Your Majesty. I shall die for you. You shall not take her. Find cover, my lady.
Yeah! Hey, nice arm!
I'm getting some good ones. Ooh, hey, there's a boy. That's a boy. Good try, son. Ooh, got it.
Help me.
At this point, Phil builds a snowman with Rita, and again, notice that Phil describes this as good, clean fun, which, in this moment, is his kind of fun. But even more than that, Phil stops being on. He's actually just being in the moment and enjoying being in that moment with Rita. This midpoint then triggers a brief honeymoon sequence. our sixth sequence here. This is where the protagonist, having made a conscious move towards their need, acts in accordance with it, and things begin to go well for them. And so, Phil and Rita have a snowball fight with some kids, they fall on the ground together laughing, and they dance on a bandstand in the snow. Rita soon says that you can't plan a day like this, while Phil argues that you can. But we are soon to see that Phil is actually wrong about that. He invites Rita up to his room and he ceases to be in the moment with her. Rather, aware of the ticking clock now, he pushes too hard to get her to stay and to try to sleep with her. He shows his hand too much, Rita clocks that something is up, and for the second time she slaps him. And there are soon many, many more slaps to come. As it turns out, you actually can't plan a perfect day. Plans can get you so far, but perfection has to be spontaneous and genuinely in the moment. If this honeymoon sequence tension was something like, will Phil succeed in sleeping with Rita, we have an answer. Absolutely not. Phil isn't ready to learn the lesson of appreciating the moment, so eventually he gives up. The middle part of our story is over, and we now move into Groundhog Day's sequence 7, away from the honeymoon and towards the low point. As I said earlier, Groundhog Day is impeccably structured. But it is slightly unusual in that what would appear to be Phil's low point comes quite early. At minute 57, Phil becomes completely depressed. Rather than look for an escape via medicine or drinking like earlier, he now takes some altogether more desperate approaches. And so we wonder some version of the question, will Phil succeed in ending the cycle by killing himself? Or perhaps, will Phil tire of attempting to end the cycle by killing himself? Here, he blows right through the depressed daytime TV phase and begins attempting suicide. He drives himself and Punxsutawney Phil off a cliff, he takes a bath with a toaster, he steps out in front of a truck, and he jumps off a church tower. Nothing works. Phil will not be able to kill himself, and so, after 9 minutes, at minute 66, we move into sequence 8 now, our last sequence of our Grand Act 2. Now again, this whole section of Groundhog Day is a bit unusual at first blush because we're moving towards what we would consider a low point in a typical Hollywood happy ending story, but things are kind of going well for Phil here in a way. Things once again slow down and he spends a really nice day with Rita while actually being genuine with her. But we also feel this tension as some kind of final attempt of escape for Phil, genuinely trying to convince Rita of his predicament and sharing his experience with her. If this doesn't work, what will? And so I find myself wondering some version of the question, can Phil convince Rita of what's happening to him, and will it make any difference? Once again, you might notice we find ourselves in the diner with Rita to tell us that a change has occurred. Phil now iconically tells Rita that he is a god, not the god, but a god. He tells Rita everything about everybody in the cafe, and then finally he does that rom-com trope thing of telling the woman how much he knows about her / what he loves about her. Also, side note, I'm convinced that if you want to get a movie star to be in your movie, you just need to write the scene where they get to say the line, "Let me tell you what's going to happen." It just works every time. Anyways, Phil and Rita spend the whole day together, and again we can see how much Phil has changed by now. He offers that he is not that smart. Also, I'll come back to this point a little bit later, but Phil says he's killed himself so many times that he doesn't even exist anymore. Finally, Rita tells Phil something really important that he seems to internalize shortly. She offers that maybe this isn't a curse, that it depends on how you look at it. Now the thing is, Phil has already been told this, at minute 30 by 2 drunk locals, right as he made his first unconscious move towards his need. Of course, at that point, he was not ready to accept that point of view, but he very soon will be, and that is story structure. But then we have our final moment of Act 2. Rita cannot stay awake any longer, and Phil tells her how much he loves her by telling her how much he admires her.
I don't deserve someone like you. But if I ever could, I swear I would love you for the rest of my life.
Did you say something?
Good night, Rita.
Phil finally truly appreciates Rita and what she represents, but he still feels like he could never deserve someone and or something like that. And so, once again, like in so many great stories, we see here that at the low point, the protagonist no longer believes the counter-argument, but the argument seems impossible. At that, Phil wakes up, once again, on Groundhog Day. We sense that he has truly given up on trying to fight it or escape it now, and so we end Act 2, and with 24 minutes left, we enter Act 3. Act 3 contains a false resolution and a true resolution, and once again, this false resolution is a tad unusual, in that normally things, again, really look bad for the protagonist here. But with two notable exceptions, that's not really the case in Groundhog Day. The first exception is that it now looks like Phil will never escape this cycle. But on the other hand, it no longer appears to bother him that much. In the last scene, Rita told him that maybe it's an opportunity and he wondered if he could ever deserve her, and now he appears to be taking that opportunity to become the best version of himself. But crucially, now he's not doing it to win Rita, but rather for the innate benefits of true self-improvement. He starts being nice to people, he reads, he learns the piano, and to ice sculpt. Should be noted as well that he told Rita in the previous sequence that when she stands in the snow, she looks like an angel. So when we see him ice sculpting, he's notably sculpting an ice angel. But Phil actually began this sequence by giving a load of money to the homeless man he's been passing by all this time. And as the sequence ends, he turns his attention firmly to this man now. And to his dismay, he discovers that no matter what he does, this homeless man will die today. This is the second exception, the limitations of what Phil can accomplish, the last thing that he has to accept. And so, curiously, the real nadir of this film about a man who can't stop living the same day over and over again is still coming face to face with death and its unavoidability. And it is only when Phil accepts that he can escape Groundhog Day, which does actually make sense, because if you truly know that one day your life will end, then you really better start enjoying it. And so, at minute 82, we enter Groundhog Day's true resolution. And like everything in the structure of Groundhog Day, the transition is just really elegant. We join Phil giving the speech of a lifetime, using Chekhov to express a true gratitude for even the colder, darker days of life. He proceeds to ask for a rain check for coffee with Rita, and then runs around town doing good deeds. Rita then discovers Phil absolutely wailing on a piano in a jazz band at the Groundhog Day party, the one that he refused to go to on day one. She buys him in a bachelor auction, and he makes a snow sculpture of her face. She says she doesn't know what to say, but Phil does.
How did you do that?
I know your face so well, I could have done it with my eyes closed.
It's lovely. I don't know what to say.
I do. No matter what happens tomorrow, or for the rest of my life, I'm happy now. Because I love you.
At the start of our story, Phil talked about not having a future. He clung to the fact that a major network was looking at him. But now, at the end of our story, Phil is truly grateful to just live in the moment and enjoy the people and the minutiae of his everyday life. He has truly transformed, and for this, he is rewarded. Rita responds, "I think I'm happy too," and the two kiss in the falling snow. Then 6 a.m. strikes again. "I Got You Babe" plays again, but this time an arm reaches across Phil, and just like that, we know Phil Connors is now in bed with Rita and therefore must have escaped Groundhog Day. He tells Rita they should live here together, and the two kiss. At that, they walk into Punxsutawney and the future. As ever, there is so much that I want to talk about with Groundhog Day, but I will limit myself to two related aspects of what makes this film so damn good in my view. First, the screenwriter Danny Rubin was famously influenced by the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, when he was writing Groundhog Day. Now, I want to stress here, first of all, that I am no expert in the works of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but I think you can clearly see this. Phil initially refuses to believe this is happening to him in sequences 2 and 3. He then lashes out and does whatever he wants for the end of sequence 3 and sequence 4. Then, in the middle of the film, he begins to bargain with the potentially more significant benefits of this experience, and so gradually moves away from his flaw and towards his need. But when his attempts to get what he wants rather than what he needs fails, he succumbs to depression in sequences 7 and 8. This is where he attempts suicide multiple times and pleads with Rita to believe him. Finally, in Act 3, sequences 9 and 10, Phil accepts his situation, and in so doing is released from the burden of it. Now, it's worth pointing out here as well that in his interview on the podcast Script Apart, Danny Rubin specifically states that the suicide attempts are representative of the death of the old Phil, which allows for the birth of the new Phil. It's this idea that he, must be fully broken down before he can be built back up again. But as far as I can see, that's not Groundhog Day. That's just about every film you can think of. That's story structure. That's kind of the why of story structure, which is why I wanted to end this season on Groundhog Day. Sometimes the 5 stages of grieving within a film could be literal grieving over an actual death, but if every story is the story of change, then what is grieved in every story is the loss of the old self before a final acceptance of the new self. You could also think of it as the protagonist's loss of their once but no longer functioning coping mechanism, or the death of their flaw. As I've covered on just about every podcast here, the first step of any Act 2 is a refusal of the call, a denial of the existence or reality of the situation or the need to change. This then generally leads to some kind of anger, often self-loathing, at what has befallen the main character. And of course, anger is not a denial of existence, but really some kind of attack or denial of legitimacy. And so, for example, in Casablanca, Rick gets drunk and abuses Ilsa at this point. In 2019's Little Women, Jo recalls her worst fights with Amy at this point. In The Empire Strikes Back, Luke gets impatient and annoyed with Yoda at this point. Now, this gives way to the middle of our film, where the bargaining takes place. If our midpoint is the protagonist's first conscious move towards their need, what is bargaining but the first conscious move towards acceptance? You cannot bargain with something you deny the existence or legitimacy of. In bargaining, you are coming to accept the reality of what is happening. Rick discovers why Ilsa left him. Jo begins to write about her own childhood as she faces up to just how sick her sister really is. And Luke realizes the dangers of impulsiveness. But the old self cannot bargain with the real and total need for change required by story. And so, in failing to bargain with change, the protagonist falls into a depression towards the low point. Rick becomes deeply cynical, Jo becomes despondent and terribly lonely at the passing of childhood, and Luke cannot accept not trying to save his friends. Then, eventually, in a happy ending at least, the protagonist truly accepts their need in the true resolution, at which point they are truly fundamentally changed. The old self has passed, and the new self is born. Our character arc, and therefore our story, is complete, and we have our reason for our story shape. So, if Groundhog Day and Danny Rubin didn't invent this, why is Groundhog Day so famous for it, and why is it such a touchstone for this idea? Well, to my mind, it has everything to do with the unique, brilliant, and perfectly executed central concept of Groundhog Day. The time loop that defines the film captures brilliantly the relationship and tension between change and stasis. Everything is superficially the same for Phil, but he is different, and therefore everything deep down is also different. It makes for an incredibly pure form of storytelling. If everything else is exactly the same, we see every contour of every moment of change for Phil Connors. This is why the diner scenes are so pivotal. Every diner scene with Rita is at the same time in the same place with the same people, but one of them is different every time, and so everything is different every time. The repetition highlights the change. Phil is scared, or gluttonous, or romantically interested, or despondent, depending on where he is on his journey. This, combined with the brilliant writing and performances, also helps Groundhog Day to be unusually character-focused. Broadly speaking, a film has a plot and a story. The plot is the contrivances and the detail, this thing happened, so this thing happened, so this thing happened. But the story is really the emotional or human arc of the character, how and why the character changes. As I said earlier, it's kind of weird that Groundhog Day doesn't have a clear inciting incident. Danny Rubin toyed around with one. At some stage in the script, there was a wronged ex-lover who cursed Phil. But, as Rubin has said, it was so superfluous to the actual story that he just decided to leave it out altogether. And so, we don't get a clear explanation for why this happens or why it stops. There's no plot explanation, just a story of a man who needs to change and who does. And because we have this, and because it's so clear, so well written, and so satisfying, we really don't get hung up on the lack of explanation. We don't really need a rational, literal explanation because we have such a sufficient emotional understanding of the story. One man lives the same day over and over again, and in so doing, he slowly learns to truly appreciate the beauty of life and those around him. It could not be clearer. Any story is really the story of change, and Groundhog Day is pure storytelling. That's what makes it such a touchstone. That's what makes it so brilliant. Well, it's like 50% that and 50% Bill Murray punching Ned Ryerson. This has been Mark Overanalyzes Film on Groundhog Day. I'm afraid it's time for another brief season break. I'll be back in about a month for season 3. If you enjoyed this episode and or this season, please like, rate, follow, recommend, and whatever else it is that's good for this kind of thing. A special thanks to Mary Kate O'Flanagan, as always, who taught me everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.